So I'd like to discuss how post-secondary ed institutions are classified. The general public really doesn't think about the extent to which institutions are classified. And so, given that you're studying this particular topic, I think it's good for us to just go into some depth here. Post-secondary ed institutions are classified in a number of different ways. Their funding model and taxation status, by their mission, by their program offerings, by their enrollment profile, by their geographic region. I have found that practitioners who aren't educated in higher ed administration or student affairs or post-secondary ed administration will often classify institutions by their funding model. Are they private? Are they public? Are they for-profit, not-for-profit? By their program offerings. Well, we're a 2-year associate degree granting institution, or we grant licensures. Also by their geographic region. We're from the South. We're from the Southeast. We're from the Northeast, mid-state, Midwest. And so when you're speaking with individuals, just be on the lookout for how they classify their institutions. And that'll give you a better understanding for what their institution is like. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these classifications. And so you'll often hear, well, our institution's a public institution. And you may or may not necessarily know what that means. That means that whoever's in charge of your institution has been elected by either a state affiliate or coordinating board. The person who's over your institution may have been elected by a board of regents or board of trustees for the institution or a system of institutions. And they're supported by public monies. They receive a subsidy as a result of taxed dollars. Public institutions by far enroll more numbers of students than private for-profit or private not-for-profit. And here are a few different types of institutions that would be considered public institutions. Private institutions are those that are not supported by public funds and can very well have a president or a CEO who's been appointed by a group of shareholders or a collective body that has really just a centralized interest in that particular institution. Now you'll notice that there are more private institutions than public institutions, but look at the number of enrollments. There's an interesting report right now that's tracking the number of institutions that have closed since 2016. Private institutions are the dominant institutional type on that list. And a lot of higher ed futurists predict more private institutions will continue to close. Public institutions, on the other hand, that have some kind of financial duress will often be merged by a larger public institution or system of the state. Trinity Lutheran is one example of a private institution that's closed since 2016. Like I said, institutions are often categorized by their geographic location. One of the ways to think about geographic location is by the regional accrediting agency. And so down in the South, our regional accrediting agency is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. In the middle states, what would be considered the Rust Belt, and what would also be considered the Middle America, if you will, the Higher Ed Learning Commission, or the Higher Learning Commission, um, which has about 19 states, if I'm not mistaken. And so people may refer to their institution by their geographic location. One way you can learn a lot about an institution in terms of being able to classify it and better understand it is by the mission statement. And so I want you to pause the video and just think about how you would define a mission statement for an institution. What would be included? What's important about it? So go ahead and pause your video now and just reflect on this question. A mission statement tells who we are and what we do. It varies in length. I've seen mission statements that are only one paragraph. I've seen other mission statements that are a complete web page. And they typically change. I think it's a misconception that mission statements are the same statement for the history of the institution, and that's not true. Usually every 5 to 7 years, when a new mission or when a new strategic plan is adopted, a new mission statement is reworded or refined. And so in our classes, we speak a lot about stakeholders: students, faculty, staff, workforce, community, state legislators. The mission statement addresses your stakeholders and provides relevant information for all of those stakeholders. Mission statements should be what grounds practice. If there's a question about whether we should move forward with a particular program or service, first and foremost, you need to make sure that it can be grounded in the mission statement, because if it's not, it doesn't belong at your institution. So, what does the mission statement tell you about the institution? I've got 4 institutions listed here. I'd like for you to pause the video, go to the websites of these 4 institutions, and see if the mission statement at those 4 institutions tells you who, what, where, why, and how of that particular institution. The best way to do this is simply go to the institution's web page, look for a search function or maybe a link that says About at the top of the web page, and you'll usually find a mission statement of an institution. Go ahead and pause your video and do that now. Okay, so I would be interested to know what similarities you found, what questions were answered about that institution, what differences did you see in terms of the mission statements between these 4 very uniquely different institutions. Again, we classify institutions in a variety of different ways. Here are a few of the examples. You may be familiar with the Carnegie classification system. I would encourage you to go back to those institutional web pages, specifically where the mission statement was found, and see if any of these classifications were listed in those mission statements. In your course module, you should have a link to the Carnegie classification system. A step 2 of this activity would be to access the Carnegie classification system, type in the institutional name to learn more about their Carnegie classification profile. So let's talk about Carnegie classification system. It was commissioned by the Department of Ed in '73. During this particular time in higher ed history, institutional expansion was rampant, and the Department of Education was providing more subsidies to students. So they needed a way to classify institutions, classify them so that they could write policy that was unique to different institutional types, so that they could do reporting and benchmarking. If they wanted to unveil a new initiative at the federal level, how were they going to be able to track that? How could they set a realistic goal? And so being able to classify institutions was important during this time in higher education history. Now, if you receive Title IV funding, meaning if your students can receive financial aid, Pell Grants, student loans, work study, then you have to report data to the Department of Ed. Also, most institutions will have to report it to the College Board and the National Science Foundation, but definitely the Department of Ed. If you submit data to these 3 different entities, then the Carnegie classification system uses that data to classify you in a variety of ways. Here are the historic classifications for the Carnegie classification system. Let's look at that classification system now. The Carnegie classification system permits a user to look up an institution by its name and then provides information related to that specific institution. You can compare institutions. You can identify a very important fact. And then from there, look at other institutions that are similar. So if I wanted to look at other institutions that were master's, college and university, the larger programs, or had an enrollment profile of higher undergraduate, I could find similar institutions. Now, you may ask, well, why is that beneficial? It's beneficial because it helps higher ed administrators in a variety of ways. One, if we're developing a new strategic plan and we're looking for measures, we can inquire about how other institutions set benchmark goals. If I am a director of advising and I want to roll out a peer advising program, for example, I may call an institution that has a similar enrollment profile and ask how they incorporated their peer mentor, advising mentor program. There's a variety of ways we can use the Carnegie classification system, but it helps us to identify institutions with similarities. Institutions do change their Carnegie classification system. They grow or they shrink in enrollment, and that does have impact on how they are identified in the Carnegie classification system. So here's just a question for you to think about. What would be the pros and cons for an institution to change its classification? Again, this is a very brief overview of different classifications for post-secondary ed institutions.